New Year's Eve was filled with sparkling ornaments and snowflakes everywhere. The city was painted in red and green lights, symbols of happiness. But in one corner of the streets, a story unlike any other was unfolding. A little 10-year-old boy, Jacob, was sitting on the curb wrapped in an old coat. In his hand was a crumpled piece of paper and a pencil, slightly darker than charcoal. With hands shaking from the cold, he tried to write the last few words. "Dear Santa, all I want this year is a family. I don't want a gift, just a warm home, please." Jacob was a boy who grew up in an orphanage. He knew nothing about his mother and father, only two names written on the back of a faded photograph: Margaret and Paul. This year, Jacob wished for something very different from the gifts other children dream of, because for him, having a family was more precious than all the toys. He folded the letter carefully, stood up with snow on his old boots, and tried to hang it on the iron ring of the street lamp. "Maybe Santa Claus will see it from here," he muttered to himself. Unaware of Jacob's innocent wish, Alexander, a millionaire businessman, was preparing to spend New Year's Eve alone. Living in a large mansion, Alexander had everything, but nothing could fill the emptiness inside him. He had wanted to have children for years, but his dream had never come true. Most people knew him for his achievements, but Alexander's life was full of loneliness. That night, as Alexander drove through the city center, he caught sight of a street lamp. He was intrigued by the piece of paper hanging under the bright lights. Curious, he got out of his car, picked it up, and began to read. As he read, he felt his heart tighten. Such an innocent wish had stirred something inside Alexander. As he folded the paper and put it in his pocket, he whispered to himself, "I must find this boy." That New Year's Eve, Jacob's wish would not just be a letter. It would be the beginning of an unexpected miracle. After putting the letter in his pocket, Alexander returned to his car with mixed feelings flooding through him. At that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in his life for a long time: a purpose. Under the cold lights of the city, he decided to take action to find Jacob. But she didn't know how to do it. He had no idea where to look to find out who the boy who hung the letter was. In the early morning light, Alexander began searching the city's social welfare agencies and orphanages. He moved from place to place where children were sheltered, but nowhere could he find any trace of the boy who had written the letter. While everyone was full of Christmas cheer, Alexander spent the day searching for hope. He didn't want to give up, because the wish in that letter was not just a child's wish, but an opportunity that could fill a void hidden inside him. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Jacob was watching the Christmas crowds. People were carrying gifts and laughing. But all Jacob wanted was to have a place of his own, a family. As he wandered the streets, he saw the faces of the children at the orphanage who had always ostracized him. "No one wants me," he muttered quietly. But she still had hope, because he had left the letter somewhere, and he believed that Santa Claus might have seen it. In the evening of that day, Alexander stood outside a cafe, exhausted from his search. When he went inside to shelter from the cold outside, his eyes immediately fell on a corner. A small boy sat in an old and worn coat. He was leaning against the table in front of him, admiring the other children drinking hot chocolate. Alexander's heart began to race. He seemed to see the face of innocence in the letter. When Jacob noticed Alexander approaching, he stepped back in fear. No one had ever looked at him so intently. Alexander began to speak in a gentle voice. "Hello, is your name Jacob?" Jacob nodded his head slightly but did not answer. Alexander continued, "I think you wrote a letter, right? I found it, and I want to help you." Jacob's eyes filled with tears. No one had ever spoken to him so kindly before, but at the same time he was cautious. "Why do you want to help me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Alexander paused for a moment, then answered honestly, "Because your wish gave me hope too. If I can help you, maybe we can both believe in this Christmas miracle." Jacob was surprised by Alexander's words. He felt his sincerity, but he was still afraid to believe. "If you are telling the truth," he said slowly, "what I want is a family, but no one wants me." These words were like a knife in Alexander's heart. He realized how much Jacob had been hurt and decided to do everything he could to change this little boy's life. The next day, they went to the orphanage. Alexander immediately set in motion the adoption proceedings. But things would not be as easy as he thought. Among the documents about Jacob's identity lay a big secret that would change the course of everything. During the paperwork process at the orphanage, Alexander was completely shocked by the detail that emerged. A small detail in Jacob's identity papers touched Alexander's past. The boy's last name glowed with familiarity. Morris. The same surname belonged to Alexander's sister, whom he had lost in a tragic accident years before. The director of the orphanage explained that Jacob had lost his parents in a car accident a few years ago, and that no one had been looking for him since then. Alexander's eyes filled with tears. Jacob could be a nephew he hadn't known existed for years. This possibility filled Alexander's heart with hope and sadness. He immediately applied for a DNA test. The waiting process was complicated for both of them. Alexander was determined to keep Jacob with him. He took him out of the orphanage and took him home. Jacob was both excited and wary of this new order. As Alexander taught Jacob how to decorate a Christmas tree, bake cookies, and wrap presents, the quiet walls of the house began to fill with laughter. Days later, the test results came back. The report confirmed Alexander's predictions. Jacob was his sister's only child. This knowledge filled Alexander's heart with indescribable love. It was clear that Jacob was no longer alone. Alexander hugged him tightly and said, "You are my family. No one will ever leave you again." Jacob was moved to tears by these words. On New Year's Eve, Alexander and Jacob flew a wishing balloon together in front of their house. "Santa Claus granted my wish," Jacob said with a smile, looking at the balloon floating in the sky. "Yes, Jacob, but I think you brought the miracle this time," Alexander replied. Jacob was no longer just a boy, but the missing piece in Alexander's life. Finding him had made his life and Jacob's life complete. On New Year's morning, Alexander received the news that the adoption was official. Jacob was now officially his son. This Christmas was a new beginning for both of them. Thanks to Jacob, Alexander had found the family bond he had lost for years. Jacob, on the other hand, had a home he would never lose again. Life had given them both a second chance, and that morning, as they hugged each other under the Christmas tree, they both knew it was a miracle. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more.